There is a quiet weight that settles in ordinary moments, like standing in a room that feels slightly too large for your presence. It does not come from a single memory or moment of loss, but from years of learning how to fill silence on your own, how to sit with yourself for longer than most. For some, this atmosphere formed early, shaped by growing up without another child beside them, without a shared witness to the same small world. Nothing about this experience is accidental or strange. It follows patterns, and it carries its own internal logic. You are invited to stay here for a moment, without naming anything, without trying to fix what you notice. Just ahead lies a deeper recognition of how this inner landscape quietly took its shape. The birth of a myth, how the only child became a problem. There is a quiet familiarity in being watched a little too closely, as if your existence always carries a footnote. People speak about you with soft certainty, attaching meaning to your silence, your independence, your way of standing slightly apart. Long before you explain yourself, a story has already been written around you. That story did not begin with you. It was shaped in a time when families were large, survival was communal, and children were expected to learn by blending into a group. A child who stood alone disrupted that image, and difference quickly became something to name, to fix, or to warn others about. The idea of the only child slowly hardened into a character, not a person, but a symbol for excess attention, imagined weakness, or quiet selfishness. It was easier to create a label than to sit with the discomfort of what could not be easily compared. Over time, repetition turned assumption into common sense. And so the myth lived on, not because it was proven, but because it was useful. It gave adults a language for unease, and children a mirror they never asked to look into. Somewhere between description and judgment, a role was quietly assigned. When a fiction becomes identity, there is a moment when you start noticing how people react before you speak, how they seem to already know something about you. Small comments land gently but repeatedly, shaping the way you listen to yourself. You begin to wonder if what they see is something you missed. As a child, you learn quickly that words repeated often enough carry weight, even when they feel slightly off. Being told you are used to being alone or too mature for your age does not sound harmful, but it settles into the background like a low hum. You adapt without realizing that adaptation is happening. Gradually, the outside story becomes an internal one. You measure your reactions, question your needs, and sometimes perform the version of yourself that seems expected. Not because it feels true, but because it feels safer than contradicting what everyone assumes. In adulthood, that early fiction often moves quietly through decisions and relationships. You may hesitate before leaning on others, or feel a subtle pressure to be self-contained at all times. The story does not shout. It simply waits, influencing how much space you believe you are allowed to take. Science versus the story we believed. At some point, another voice enters the room, softer and less dramatic, offering data instead of judgment. It suggests that the old assumptions were never as solid as they sounded, that outcomes are shaped by far more than sibling count. But facts move slowly when stories have already settled in. What science gently reveals is not a replacement narrative, but a pause, a recognition that what was once framed as deficiency may have been difference, and that difference was never given room to breathe. The damage was not in being alone, but in being defined by it. Yet even as the myth loosens its grip, its imprint remains. People rarely announce when they stop believing something, and children rarely get informed when a label no longer applies. The gap between knowledge and lived experience stays wide, and so the story and the science exist side by side, not canceling each other out. One speaks in charts and studies, the other in memory and tone. Somewhere in between, the only child continues to live, carrying both without needing to resolve them. The loneliness no one sees. There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't arrive with sadness, but with absence. It feels like being present in a room where nothing is missing, yet nothing fully responds to you either. You learn early that being alone does not always mean feeling lonely, and that feeling lonely does not require being alone. As a child, much of life happens without witnesses. Your thoughts are not overheard by siblings. Your small victories and quiet fears are processed internally, without reflection or interruption. The world feels orderly, but slightly hollow, as if emotions echo instead of landing. This creates a subtle emotional landscape where experience exists without immediate validation. You feel deeply, but you do not always learn how to share the feeling while it is happening. Instead, you carry it until it fades, or until it turns into something more manageable, like logic or distance. In adulthood, this form of loneliness often goes unnoticed by others. You may appear independent, composed, even self-sufficient, while a quieter part of you remains unused to being emotionally witnessed. It is not a wound that demands attention, only a pattern that waits patiently in the background. The little adult, growing up too early. You might recognize the feeling of being more comfortable around adults than peers, even before you could explain why. Conversations felt easier when they were structured, when emotions were implied rather than loud. Childhood, in that sense, moved quickly and quietly, without siblings to pull you sideways into chaos. Much of your social world unfolded vertically. You learned by observing adults, adapting to their rhythms, their moods, their expectations. Maturity arrived not as a choice, but as the environment you learned to breathe in. This early closeness to adulthood often shaped how you handled responsibility. You became attuned to tone, timing, and restraint. Reading rooms before entering them. Play existed, but it was often private, controlled, or internal. Later in life, this early adulthood lingers. You may feel older than your age in moments of crisis, yet oddly younger when it comes to asking for care. The child did not disappear, but learned to stay quiet, waiting for permission that was never explicitly given. Socialization on hard mode. Social interaction can feel like entering a space where everyone else received instructions you somehow missed. You watch carefully, adjust quickly, and often get it right, but the process is rarely effortless. There is always a sense of calibration happening beneath the surface. In childhood, social learning lacked repetition. Conflicts did not unfold daily at home. Negotiations were not practiced in real time with equals. You learned about people more through observation than immersion, which made social understanding deep, but slower to activate. As an adult, this can split in two directions. Some become deeply accommodating, smoothing edges before they appear, becoming skilled at maintaining harmony. Others retreat, choosing solitude not out of fear, but out of fatigue from constant self-monitoring. Both paths come from the same root, a system that learned social connection carefully, deliberately, without the cushion of trial and error. It is not dysfunction, just effort, carried quietly into every interaction. The weight of expectation and responsibility. There is a particular heaviness that comes from knowing there is no one to hand things off to. When something goes wrong, the silence around you feels final, as if responsibility has nowhere else to land. You carry it without announcing that you are doing so. As a child, expectations rarely needed to be divided. Attention, hope, worry, and pride all gathered in one place. Often, without words, you learned to sense what was needed before it was asked, and to become reliable before you understood what reliability meant. Over time, this shaped an identity closely tied to performance. Doing well felt less like success and more like maintaining balance, keeping something from tipping over. Failure, even small, carried an emotional weight that felt larger than the moment itself. In adulthood, responsibility often feels personal rather than situational. You may struggle to separate who you are from what you carry, not because you were taught to be strong, but because there was never anyone else assigned the role. Shadow traits. How adaptation turns heavy. Some habits feel like personality, until you notice how tired your body is from maintaining them. The constant thinking ahead, the subtle need to stay in control, the reflex to take responsibility before it is offered. These traits once kept things stable. They formed quietly, as solutions rather than flaws. When there was no one to absorb emotional overflow, you learned to contain it. When unpredictability felt unsafe, you learned to anticipate, to manage outcomes before they arrived. Later in life, these same adaptations can feel heavier than before. Overthinking replaces rest. Self-blame arrives faster than compassion. Competence becomes an unspoken requirement. What once protected you now demands energy you rarely acknowledge spending. There is no clear moment when adaptation becomes burden. It happens gradually, blending into daily life. Mistaken for character, the traits remain useful, just heavier, asking to be seen rather than removed. Love, loss, and the truth beneath the stereotype. Intimacy can feel both familiar and distant, like standing close to someone while still holding your breath. You know how to be present, attentive, and loyal, yet part of you remains careful, watching for shifts in emotional ground. Love feels real, but never careless. Early bonds taught you that closeness and solitude can exist at the same time. You learned to self-soothe, to wait, to accept emotional pauses without protest. These skills carried into relationships, sometimes as steadiness, sometimes as quiet withdrawal. When parents age or disappear, something deeper often surfaces. The realization that there are no shared witnesses to childhood, no one else holding the same memories. Grief becomes solitary, not because it is unsupported, but because it is singular. Beneath the stereotype, the truth is quieter. Being an only child was never a lack, but a specific way of adapting to the world. And adaptation, once seen clearly, does not demand correction, only recognition. It returns to that familiar quiet, the room where you learn to sit with yourself, listening longer than anyone expected. Over time, something subtle took shape there, a way of watching, of carrying your own company a little too carefully. That history is something you lived through, not a definition of who you are. It was a response that made sense once, a private arrangement with silence when no one else was meant to share it. And sometimes, that same pattern doesn't stop at being alone. It moves earlier, deeper, into the moment a child realizes they must arrive prepared, already steady, already grown.